Thinking about the A7 IV, here's what no one's telling you. I've been using the A7 IV the past 2 years along with every other camera you might consider instead. There's a ton of new cameras hitting the market, and I can't say the A7 IV makes sense for everyone. But for a specific type of shooter, this might be perfect. So let's break down if the A7 IV is still worth it and if it's right for you. Also, I'll leave links down below for the best pricing on the A7 IV and the cameras I compare it to. When Sony first dropped the A7 IV, it was a massively popular camera, mainly for one reason. It had a brand new 33 megapixel full frame sensor. At the time, no other brand had this much resolution for the price. And 33 megapixels is a ridiculous amount of resolution. You can literally zoom in and see someone's pores. And having this much detail is phenomenal for recropping and retouching, and it's of course great for printing. On top of that, it also shoots 4K video that is downsampled from 7K, basically giving you 7K detail in your 4K video. But there are some downsides to this sensor that you'll see in this video. Now, when you compare the A7 IV to its main competition, the R6 Mark II, the Z6 III, and the Lumix S5 IIX, they actually have a 24 megapixel full frame sensor, so in terms of sheer resolution, the A7 IV is still king. But there's always more to a camera than just resolution, because one of the major reasons the A7 IV was so popular was the autofocusing system, which actually matches the performance of a $6,500 flagship camera, the Sony A1, which is now technically a $5,400 camera, but for the time, it was incredible. And even now, the autofocus is incredibly fast, even in low light, and features reliable face and eye tracking with animal and bird eye detect as well, making it a great camera for shooting almost anything. And it also has this lovely feature known as color mapping, which is also in other Sony cameras, but it basically uses a color map to show you what's in focus and what's not, and it's super useful for manual focusing. However, the A7 IV doesn't have the latest Sony autofocus like AI subject detect, which does improve performance quite a bit, and most of the newer, even cheaper Sony cameras have this feature. That said, the update to the A7 IV, the A7 V, will have Sony's latest autofocusing technology. So compared to other newer Sony cameras, the A7 IV is a bit behind in terms of autofocus, but when you compare it to the competition, like the R6 Mark II, the Lumix S5 IIX, and the Nikon Z6 III, this autofocus is just as good, if not slightly better, and most people will be perfectly happy with it. And one of the most important features in a hybrid camera like this is stabilization, and the A7 IV does have 5-axis in-body stabilization, but it's 5.5 stops, which is really good, and most of you guys will be perfectly happy. But I have to mention, the newer cameras like the R6 Mark II and the newer Sony cameras now have 8 stops of stabilization, and the Lumix S5 IIX is basically as smooth as a gimbal. And you might think, well, the A7 IV has to be worse. Here's the thing, there's not really that much of a difference between 5 stops and 8 stops of stabilization. Unless you're like a very serious shooter, most of you guys will not notice, and I don't recommend picking up the other cameras just for the extra stops of stabilization. Now, whether this matters to you or not really depends on how much you shoot handheld. I'm mostly a handheld shooter, and it really doesn't affect me that much, but it also depends on whether you shoot photos or videos. So let's talk about how the photos and videos actually look. Now, when it comes to shooting photos with this camera, there are some major things to note, and some of these things might be deal breakers. In single frame mode, you get 14-bit RAW, but in continuous, you only get 12-bit RAW. This will give you less flexibility when color grading and also a slight reduction in dynamic range. But if you do need 14-bit RAW in continuous mode, you can shoot at a slower 6 frames per second in uncompressed RAW. Personally, I don't think most people will see the difference. However, the competing cameras do not have this issue, because the R6 Mark II can actually do 12 frames per second mechanical shutter mode at 14-bit RAW, and it also shoots at a ridiculous 40 frames per second in electronic shutter mode at 12-bit RAW. However, it is a lower 24 megapixel sensor. And the brand new Nikon Z6 III can do 14 frames per second in 14-bit RAW and 20 frames per second in 14-bit RAW. But again, 24 megapixel sensor. Now, whether the A7 IV is right for you really depends on your shooting style and how fast you want to shoot and how much resolution you need for your subject matter. Because nothing else really matches the A7 IV in terms of speed and resolution, because nothing else can give you 10 frames per second even in 12-bit RAW at 33 megapixels. So for someone that prioritizes resolution like myself, the A7 IV is still an amazing camera. I personally like the A7 IV for photos, but video is where things get spicy, because this is where you see its biggest strengths and downsides. With the high resolution sensor, it does 7K downsample to 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second. So you get 7K detail, but in a 4K video that's also much easier to edit than a 7K video file. And this also helps to reduce the noise in high ISO and low light situations. But in 4K 60, which is a very important video mode for most video shooters, it has a really heavy 1.5 times crop, which zooms your image way in and you get more of an APS-C size field of view. However, the 4K 60 mode is downsampled from 4.6K for better image quality. This is probably not going to change in the A7 IV either because it's actually a sensor issue and not a processor issue. Humble flex, but I talked to an actual Sony engineer about this at Sony Condo in 2024, and this is what he told me. Personally, I hate cropping into my sensor, but some of you guys may not care. On the bright side, it does do full HD up to 120 frames per second with no crop. And there's also no record limit or overheating issues on this camera unless you're working in extreme conditions like the desert. Now, you have to make sure that there's airflow at the bottom of the camera and the screen has to be flipped open and you should be just fine. The downside is when shooting video, there is quite a lot of rolling shutter because of the high megapixel sensor. And lower megapixel sensors like the R6 Mark II, the Z6 III, or even the Lumix S5 IIX do not have a serious rolling shutter issue like the A7 IV. Personally, I don't really notice the rolling shutter because I'm never going to whip my camera back and forth like this. I'm mainly focused on cinematic work. Now, compared to the competition, the only camera that crops in at 4K 60 is a Lumix S5 IIX, which is about $500 cheaper than the A7 IV. But the R6 Mark II and the Z6 III, which cost about the same, actually do not crop in at 4K 60, but the R6 Mark II actually downsamples its 4K 60 from 6K, and the Z6 III actually shoots 6K 12-bit RAW video. So technically, there are better cameras out there when it comes to frame rates, but they do have a lower megapixel sensor. But 7K versus 6K isn't that much of a difference, but what's more important than resolution and frame rates is actually dynamic range and video codecs. The A7 IV actually has 12.8 stops of dynamic range, which is actually very close to the very popular Sony FX3 and the A7S III, and the A7 IV also uses a very high bitrate codec of 600 megabits per second with 10-bit 422 color in all of its modes, and you also have S-Log3, HLG, Cinema 1 through 4, and S-Log2, so you basically have a lot of really great options when it comes to color grading. When it comes to the competing cameras like the R6 Mark II, it actually has a lower 11.1 stops of dynamic range, and the Z6 III has the lowest at 10.5 stops of dynamic range. The R6 Mark II also uses a lower bitrate codec, which is about half the data rates of the A7 IV, though the Z6 III has 12-bit internal RAW at 6K and ProRes at 5K and 4K, which is significantly higher than any of the cameras we've talked about in this video. So the Z6 III video codecs are much better than the A7 IV, R6, and honestly, it's the king of video codecs right now. So if you're someone that doesn't want the massive file sizes of RAW and ProRes, but you do care about color flexibility and dynamic range, the A7 IV is still a fantastic camera, especially with the 7K downsample to 4K, and I do think this is a great camera for cinematic filmmakers that aren't shooting a lot of action, because honestly, like, who does this? I don't. But let's not forget about design, because if the design doesn't work for you, the camera's not going to work for you. The A7 IV is a really beefy camera, but it has a rugged, weather-sealed body. The button layout is completely customizable, including all of the dials, and it has several custom buttons on it, and a toggle to go between photo, video, and slow motion very quickly. And it also has the newest Sony menus for better navigation that are also customizable, and you can even set up your own custom menu under My Menu. The viewfinder is fantastic, and the side articulating screen has touch controls over everything, including focus and menus. Plus, it has dual SD card slots. The first one can take SD and CF Express, and the second one is SD only. So you could do photos to the SD card and video to the CF Express. And thank God it has a full-size HDMI and a hard plastic door to cover all of your I/O to prevent dust and moisture. The best part about this camera has to be the massive selection of Sony first-party lenses and the third-party lenses, and there's even companies out there now making cinema lenses that directly go into a Sony E-mount, so you don't need a PL adapter. The best example I can give is the Sure lenses and the Typox Chimeras. Is it Samara or Shamera? Sony cameras, without a doubt, always have the best selection of lenses, Plus, the A7 IV also has a large FC100 Pro style battery, and it's going to give you an hour and a half of non-stop video and at least 500 photos. Anyone from a beginner to a pro will love this camera, but there are some things you should know. When you compare it to the competition like the R6 Mark II, the Lumix S5 IIs, and the Z6 III, they all have a brighter and higher resolution screen on the back, and the newer Sony cameras also have a better screen, and they now have a brand new design that lets you use the screen either as a tilt screen or a side articulating screen, which I really like. And the A7 IV will have these features as well. So if you're someone that likes to nitpick about design, like the LCD screen, the A7 IV upgrade might be worth it. So ultimately, is this camera outdated? Who is it for? And is it still worth your money? In terms of resolution, the A7 IV is still king. And for this price, nothing else even comes close to the resolution. Despite dropping down to 12-bit RAW in continuous shooting and only getting 6 frames per second in 14-bit continuous, this thing still takes amazing photos. But it's definitely worth considering the alternatives if you want a constant 14-bit RAW. In terms of video, nothing else does 7K downsampled, but the R6 Mark II comes pretty close at 6K, and the Z6 III does 6K RAW internally, and neither of those cameras crop in 4K 60. But unsurprisingly, the Sony camera has better dynamic range and better video codecs. But if you like to shoot continuous at 14-bit and 4K 60 for slow motion without the crop, I think the competition is definitely better. And the A7 IV is not going to fix the video frame rate issues, but it is going to have 14-bit RAW across the board. So if I did pick up this camera, it would have to be on a very steep sale. And I often see the A7 IV as much as $500 off. So if you want the best pricing on this camera, I'll leave links down below and I will update them as sales come up. So check those out and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.